Hey, welcome to Black Justice Chronicles, where each story is a revolution of truth and resilience. Get ready for a journey that celebrates the power of justice. It appears that no actual transcript of the incident was provided beyond the video's title, which references a situation where a woman, popularly labeled a Karen, calls emergency services on a black man simply because he was sitting in his own car. Without a transcript, we lack direct quotations, timestamps, or precise dialogue exchanges. However, by examining the title and drawing on common social contexts in similar incidents, we can infer that the central conflict revolves around racial bias, the misuse of emergency services, and the unjust suspicion cast upon an innocent individual. For the sake of clarity and consistency in our expanded discussion, let us rename the individuals and important nouns within this scenario. We will refer to the woman as Mary Thompson and the black man as Daniel Green. The city's emergency line or police department will be known as the Cedarbrook Police Department, and the neighborhood where this takes place will be called Maplewood Heights. With these placeholders, we can structure our exploration and avoid ambiguity as we delve into parts 2 through 7. Without a transcript, we cannot pinpoint how long Mary Thompson observed Daniel Green or the exact words she used when contacting the Cedarbrook Police Department. We also do not know the precise exchange between Mary and Daniel, or how the responding officers may have handled the confrontation. Nevertheless, the video's title strongly suggests an incident of unwarranted suspicion based on Daniel's appearance and presence in the neighborhood. This leads to broader discussions on prejudice, racial profiling, and the everyday challenges people of color face when carrying out normal tasks in public spaces. Because no official dialogue is available, much remains speculative. Still, the title hints at an upsetting pattern. An innocent person, minding his own business, is suddenly subjected to scrutiny and potential harm because someone else feels entitled or justified in calling the police. In many similar narratives, the alleged Karen believes she is defending her community from perceived threats. In reality, she is using the emergency system to validate her bias or to enforce her personal sense of who belongs and who does not. The lack of a transcript compels us to rely on broader social experiences and documented real-life events where similar incidents have unfolded. This means that in the subsequent parts, we will focus on expanding the situation creatively. We will hypothesize the perspectives of both Mary Thompson and Daniel Green, weaving a plausible sequence of events consistent with the typical issues highlighted in cases of racial bias. We will also examine how local law enforcement might have responded, how bystanders, if any, could have reacted, and how the aftermath might have affected those involved. Despite the absence of direct quotes, the essence of the scenario remains clear. It points to the misuse of authority, through calling the police, when an individual acts on prejudice rather than a genuine concern. As we move forward, we will examine each aspect of this situation in greater depth, referencing Mary, Daniel, Maplewood Heights, and the Cedarbrook Police Department to bring these hypothetical events to life. Derived from the video's title and common patterns in similar incidents, this story begins with Mary Thompson living in Maplewood Heights, a suburban area not far from the downtown region of Cedarbrook. Maplewood Heights is typically known for its tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and residents who pride themselves on community values. Yet beneath the carefully manicured exterior, unspoken biases sometimes simmer. One afternoon, Mary Thompson glances out her front window and notices a car she does not recognize parked on the side of the street. With a slightly furrowed brow, she fixates on the vehicle. From her vantage point, it seems as though the person in the driver's seat, Daniel Green, has been there for quite some time. She can't see precisely what he is doing, and because Daniel does not step out, Mary's curiosity morphs into suspicion. Why is this unfamiliar man parked here? Is he casing the neighborhood, waiting to break into a house, or engaging in some other illicit activity? Mary's internal monologue begins to spiral. She recalls neighborhood watch meetings where the importance of vigilance was stressed. She remembers warnings to report any strange activity. She also recalls hearing rumors of small-time thefts happening in a nearby cul-de-sac. Though she has never personally encountered such issues on her street, fear mingles with prejudice in her mind. She finds herself reaching for her phone. Dialing the number for the Cedarbrook Police Department, Mary voices her concerns. Her tone is measured, but firm, as she informs the dispatcher that there is a suspicious vehicle outside her home. She describes the car, the license plate, as far as she can see, and the occupant, namely, Daniel Green. She notes his approximate height and build and mentions that he has been parked there for far too long. In the back of her mind, she wonders if she is overreacting, but that thought is swiftly overridden by the notion that she might prevent something terrible from happening. Meanwhile, Daniel is completely unaware of Mary Thompson's growing alarm. He's waiting in his own vehicle, a modest sedan with a few dents on the bumper, for a friend who lives just down the street. Daniel chose this spot because it was easy to find, and he simply needed to respond to a few emails on his phone before heading to his friend's house. He is also making sure not to text while driving, having pulled over as a responsible measure. Little does he know that his conscientious choice has inadvertently sparked a crisis in Maplewood Heights. In due course, Daniel notices a squad car from the Cedarbrook Police Department pulling up behind him. Confusion overtakes him. Did he park illegally? Did someone report his car as stolen? A knot forms in his stomach as an officer steps out. The officer approaches his window, politely asking for license and registration. There is an undertone of tension. Daniel senses that this is more than just a random check. The officer's posture is guarded, and the conversation feels cautious. Back at her window, Mary watches intently. She half expects to see the officer uncover wrongdoing, maybe a stash of stolen goods or something else. But from what she can see, Daniel is calm, handing over his documents. The conversation seems cordial, with Daniel explaining the reason for his presence. The officer walks back to the squad car to run Daniel's information. During that moment, Mary experiences a sudden flicker of doubt. Perhaps she has acted prematurely. The stage is now set for a confrontation that exposes more than just a misunderstanding. In many such incidents, deeper social issues bubble to the surface: prejudice, the tension between personal safety and unwarranted suspicion, and the lasting effects of calling law enforcement on someone who was not causing any harm. With Mary Thompson, Daniel Green, and the Cedarbrook Police Department all in play, Maplewood Heights finds itself at the center of an unfolding drama that will highlight both the fragility of trust and the importance of confronting underlying biases. A woman, often referred to as a Karen, calls 911 on a black man who was simply sitting in his own car. In our expanded scenario, that woman is Mary Thompson, and the man is Daniel Green. This particular afternoon in Maplewood Heights had started out uneventful for both. Mary's routine involved tidying her home, scanning the local neighborhood watch forum, and ensuring her children, if she had any, were safe. Daniel, meanwhile, was patiently waiting to meet a friend who lived just a few houses down. The calm turned into an unnecessary storm when Mary decided Daniel's presence was threatening enough to merit a call to the Cedarbrook Police Department. From Mary's perspective, a stream of subconscious cues fueled her anxiety: news reports about crime, stories of outsiders allegedly prowling around neighborhoods, and the unspoken notion that certain people don't belong in Maplewood Heights unless they're visibly engaged in an approved activity, like dog walking, jogging, or visiting a clearly recognizable neighbor. Daniel was simply sitting in his car. To Mary, the stillness looked suspicious. Why wasn't he moving? Why wasn't he getting out to knock on someone's door? The deeper issue, of course, was that Mary's suspicion rested on stereotypes. Daniel was a man of color in a predominantly white neighborhood, and Mary's preconceived notions, whether she acknowledged them or not, shaped her perception of him. Sitting calmly in one's own vehicle, it seems, should not ordinarily raise alarms. And yet, Mary's call to the police painted him as a potential danger. In that single phone call, the power of prejudice and an unsubstantiated fear combined to transform an innocent moment into a police matter. For Daniel, the day's unraveling events were a painful reminder of a broader societal pattern. Like many people of color, he knew all too well that ordinary actions, like birdwatching in a park, taking photographs, or even waiting in a parked car, can lead to overreactions by strangers. As the police approached him, the color seemed to drain from his face. He felt a pang in his chest, a flash of fear that this situation could escalate into something far more serious. Even a small miscommunication could put him at risk. Once Daniel handed over his license and registration, he tried to maintain an air of calm. The officer, following procedure, asked a series of questions. Why was he there? Whom was he waiting for? Was the vehicle registered in his name? With each inquiry, Daniel sensed the subtle weight of suspicion upon him. Though the officer attempted to keep it professional, the subtext was clear: someone had called them because they believed he might be a threat. Mary, meanwhile, observed the exchange from her window. Initially, she felt validated. The police had arrived quickly, and if there were indeed something nefarious at play, it would be handled. But as time passed and she saw Daniel speaking respectfully with the officer, she found her conviction wavering. Nothing in Daniel's body language or demeanor suggested wrongdoing. She'd expected confrontation, some sign of guilt that would vindicate her call. Instead, she saw what looked more like an inconvenient and potentially frightening situation for Daniel. Neighbors started peering out of their curtains or stepping outside to see what was happening. Maplewood Heights had always prided itself on being a nice place to live, but the scene now was tense. One or two neighbors, recognizing Daniel, shouted a friendly greeting, or tried to wave at the officer to indicate that this was all a misunderstanding. Their attempts to calm the situation only highlighted the awkwardness of it all, a man singled out by little more than Mary's hasty judgment. And so, the snapshot we have is a microcosm of a larger issue. People from certain backgrounds often face heightened scrutiny, even while performing normal tasks. A single phone call can weaponize prejudice, turning routine moments into nerve-wracking episodes. In this story, Mary Thompson's decision to label Daniel Green as suspicious is the catalyst for a chain of events that will test both individuals' outlooks. As we move on, we'll see how Mary's assumptions and Daniel's reality clash head-on, revealing uncomfortable truths about fear, bias, and the far-reaching consequences of a hurried call to the police. Her assumption that he was doing something wrong prompts the call to law enforcement. Expanding upon this, we see how Mary Thompson's immediate interpretation of Daniel Green's presence caused her to act. Maplewood Heights was not a place accustomed to overt crime, at least not the sort that hits local headlines. Yet, Mary's mental catalogue of warnings about outsiders loomed large. She'd read social media updates about break-ins in other neighborhoods, listened intently during local watch meetings, and been told time and time again that vigilance was the key to keeping Maplewood Heights safe. From a certain angle, Mary might have believed she was doing her civic duty. The storyline she constructed in her mind was that Daniel, a stranger in a car, might be waiting for an opportunity to commit mischief or worse. The only concrete detail supporting this theory, however, was that Mary did not recognize him or his vehicle. She could not see beyond Daniel's tinted windows, she did not know his reason for being there. Rather than assuming he was perhaps a friend of a neighbor, a courier, or simply lost, she gravitated toward the worst-case scenario. When Mary made the call to the Cedarbrook Police Department, she framed her words carefully, explaining that there was a suspicious person in her neighborhood. She mentioned how he had been loitering in his car for some time. This choice of words carried weight. Loitering implied he had no legitimate business in the area. Although Mary did not explicitly mention Daniel's race during the initial call, her tone conveyed alarm. A signal to the dispatcher that the situation might be serious. Meanwhile, Daniel had a completely different view of his day. He was excited to catch up with a longtime friend who had recently moved to Maplewood Heights. The friend had texted him, "Come by around 3 p.m. I'll be home after my shift." Daniel, wanting to be punctual, arrived a bit early. With no place to park in the friend's narrow driveway, he opted for the curb. Needing to respond to some work emails, he figured it was best to do so before going inside. For him, it was a simple, responsible action. In his mind, he was being courteous by not texting and driving. While Mary's assumption set off a chain reaction, Daniel was none the wiser. He scrolled through his phone, tapping out quick replies to colleagues. The interior of his sedan was comfortable, and he was focused on wrapping up tasks before meeting his friend. It never crossed his mind that someone might interpret his presence as threatening. He felt no need to rush or fidget, he was simply waiting, as anyone might, in a safe suburban area. By the time the Cedarbrook Police Department dispatcher relayed Mary's concern to the responding officer, the situation had already been framed in a suspicious light. The officer, following standard protocol, arrived with caution. He was prepared to defuse any potential conflict or stop a crime if necessary. Upon approaching Daniel's car, he noticed the occupant engrossed in his phone. Nothing immediately jumped out as illegal or dangerous. Still, the officer's training taught him to keep his guard up. False alarms or misunderstandings can escalate if either party becomes defensive or frightened. Daniel's heart pounded when he saw the patrol car's flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He wondered if his brake lights were out, or if perhaps he had parked incorrectly. The officer's presence hinted at a more serious reason. As the officer asked for documentation, Daniel complied politely. The officer explained that a resident had reported suspicious activity. Daniel struggled to keep his frustration under control. He had heard of these scenarios before, people of color being reported for benign acts. Now, it was happening to him. Mary, peering from behind her curtains, experienced a rush of mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt gratified that her vigilance was taken seriously. On the other, as she watched Daniel respond calmly, she began to question whether her instincts might have been misguided. The creeping sense of doubt unsettled her. What if Daniel was truly innocent? What if he was just visiting someone in the neighborhood? Worry and guilt twisted inside her, even as she maintained the external posture of someone protecting her community. Through these parallel viewpoints, we see how a single assumption fueled a spiraling set of events. Mary's interpretation of Daniel's harmless behavior led her to involve the authorities, and now both Daniel and the responding officer had to manage a tense situation. The question looming was how far this misunderstanding would go, and whether there was room for empathy and insight to replace the reflex of suspicion. Ultimately, one call to the police can alter the course of an entire day, or even an entire life. For those on the receiving end of that suspicion, the situation escalates due to prejudice and the misuse of emergency services. In the case of Mary Thompson and Daniel Green, these words point to what can happen when biases are amplified by the legal mechanisms meant to protect and serve. Once the call is made to the Cedarbrook Police Department, there is no going back. The presence of law enforcement changes the dynamic drastically. Even if the officer arrives with the best intentions, the potential for escalation exists, especially when fueled by preconceived notions. In the minutes following the officer's arrival, Daniel feels his heart racing. Every movement he makes feels scrutinized. He wonders if he should keep his hands on the steering wheel, place them on his lap, or hold them out the window. Even the simplest actions, like reaching for his registration in the glove compartment, seem fraught with danger. Daniel's mind flashes with the stories he has heard, men and women who found themselves in precarious situations simply because an officer misread their actions. He does not want to become another statistic or headline. The officer himself is trying to piece together the situation. Mary's description of a loitering individual and the reality before his eyes are not matching up perfectly. Daniel appears cooperative. His car is registered to him. He has a valid driver's license and no outstanding warrants. The sense of immediate threat that Mary implied is absent. Yet, the officer cannot dismiss the call outright. He has a duty to investigate, and ignoring a citizen's concerns could be seen as negligence. This puts him in a delicate position. How does he remain thorough without unnecessarily harassing an innocent person? Mary, meanwhile, watches from her living room window. A wave of conflicting emotions sweeps over her. On one hand, she still believes she did the right thing. She feels it is better to err on the side of caution than to overlook a genuine danger. On the other hand, she feels a growing unease about how Daniel appears completely non-threatening. Could her biases have led her to misuse emergency services? She glances at her phone, now buzzing with texts from a neighbor who saw the police cruiser. "What's happening?" her neighbor asks. Mary is not entirely sure how to respond. In some instances, such calls can escalate if the officer, the suspect, or even bystanders become agitated. The line between a simple misunderstanding and a full-blown conflict can be razor-thin. Here in Maplewood Heights, that line feels especially precarious. If Daniel were to question the officer too aggressively or refuse a request, the encounter could take a sudden turn. If Mary were to rush outside and confront Daniel directly, tensions could spike. Misunderstandings feed on themselves, building to a crescendo that is difficult to calm. This risk of escalation is precisely why the misuse of emergency services is so problematic. When individuals like Mary phone the police for something that might be resolved with a conversation, such as politely asking, "Hey, are you visiting someone on this block?" they initiate a process that can place innocent people in jeopardy. The police are trained to respond to potential crimes, not neighborly confusion. Once they arrive, the gloves come off, in a manner of speaking. Every participant in the situation might act on heightened alert. What intensifies prejudice is the underlying assumption that someone doesn't belong. Mary's suspicion was not solely about Daniel's presence, it was influenced by her internal biases about what is normal or acceptable in Maplewood Heights. Even after seeing Daniel cooperatively speak to the officer, Mary struggles to reconcile the difference between the image in her head, a suspicious figure up to no good, and the reality of a polite visitor quietly waiting for a friend. In other circumstances, Daniel might have felt confident enough to speak with Mary or wave to reassure her he meant no harm. But he knows too well that such attempts can be misread. A friendly wave might be perceived as suspiciously trying to hide something, or stepping out of the car could be seen as aggression. When prejudice meets the potential threat of law enforcement, the safest path is often silence and compliance. And that, in itself, is a tragedy. It stifles genuine human connection and understanding. Hence, what starts as a simple phone call spirals into a scenario fraught with tension. Daniel, feeling targeted, tries to maintain composure. Mary, now questioning herself, grapples with guilt and stubborn fear. The officer stands in the middle, unsure whether to treat this as a non-issue or a potential crime in progress. This is how prejudice and the misuse of emergency services intersect. By taking an ordinary moment and cloaking it in fear, hostility, and the painful recognition of how racial bias can warp everyday life. The man discovers key info or evidence that reveals the woman's bias or invalid complaint. In the unfolding story of Mary Thompson and Daniel Green, this moment arrives when Daniel, at last, learns precisely why the Cedarbrook Police Department was summoned to Maplewood Heights. As the officer runs his information, Daniel overhears fragments of a police radio conversation. He picks up the words, resident, loitering, and, looks suspicious. Slowly, it dawns on him that Mary called the police under the assumption that he was doing something illicit simply by waiting in his car. It's not the first time Daniel has witnessed or experienced bias. However, there is something particularly jarring about realizing that a peaceful moment, answering work emails in his parked sedan, could trigger such a reaction. He glances over at Mary's house and notices her silhouette behind the curtains. Anger bubbles inside him. Was there no better way for her to handle her concerns? Couldn't she have simply approached him from a safe distance, inquired if he needed assistance, or perhaps observed for a few more minutes to see if anything was truly amiss? While Daniel grapples with these questions, the officer returns from running the background check. He politely informs Daniel that everything is clear, no warrants, no criminal record, and the vehicle registration matches Daniel's name. The officer seems apologetic, though he refrains from criticizing the call outright. In a somewhat hesitant tone, he says, "We had a report of suspicious activity, but you seem to be here on legitimate business." He also inquires, "Are you waiting for someone?" Daniel confirms that he's about to visit his friend who lives at the end of the block. At this point, Daniel decides he needs clarity. "Officer, can you tell me what exactly this woman claimed I was doing? The officer, still trying to be diplomatic, mentions that Mary reported a strange car parked for an extended time, implying it was suspicious behavior. Daniel feels a surge of frustration. Being quiet in one's own car is hardly an unusual act. That frustration is deepened by the knowledge of how quickly calls like these can escalate for people of color. The tenuous line between just waiting and criminal suspect is often shaped by someone else's biases. As Daniel tries to maintain composure, a neighbor, Carol Jensen, walks over. She happens to know Daniel's friend, who had mentioned Daniel would be coming by that afternoon. Carol, having caught wind of the police presence, decides to intervene. She greets the officer warmly, then turns to Daniel. "You must be the friend John was expecting," she says, referencing Daniel's friend. Carol then looks pointedly toward Mary's house. In a quiet, somewhat exasperated voice, she adds, "I think Mary might have overreacted." Seeing Carol's intervention, the officer grows more confident that Daniel poses no threat. In fact, he suggests Daniel proceed to his friend's house. Meanwhile, Mary, noticing the little gathering outside, feels her anxiety spike. She cracks her front door open, stepping out onto her porch. Torn between embarrassment and lingering conviction, she calls out, "Is everything okay?" She addresses the officer but also glances at Daniel with a mix of apology and wariness in her eyes. Daniel, with his newly gained knowledge, decides to speak up. He explains that he's simply visiting a friend and was answering emails in his parked car. He clarifies that he has every right to be in Maplewood Heights. He mentions how startled he was to see the police, especially when he had done nothing illegal. The implicit message is clear: Mary's complaint was based on an unfounded assumption. One likely tied to the fact that Daniel, a black man, did not fit Mary's idea of who belongs in the neighborhood. The presence of Carol, who corroborates Daniel's story, strengthens his position. Suddenly, Mary is faced with undeniable evidence that she acted prematurely. The glances from other neighbors, some of whom have begun to gather on their porches, make Mary uncomfortably aware that she might be perceived as biased or even prejudiced. She tries to stammer an explanation about recent break-ins, about wanting to keep the area safe, but the justification rings hollow when weighed against the harmless reality of Daniel's actions. In that instant, Daniel sees clearly that Mary's report was grounded in fear, not fact. He recognizes that her bias, whether conscious or subconscious, led to an invalid complaint that disrupted his afternoon and could have placed him in real danger. This revelation underscores the power imbalance in calling the police on someone based on mere assumptions. Daniel realizes that all it took was one phone call to cast him as a potential criminal. He plans to address the matter more fully, perhaps speaking with the Maplewood Heights Community Association or even seeking advice on how to prevent such situations in the future. The story has not yet concluded. The key evidence that Mary acted out of unwarranted suspicion has come to light, but the aftermath may linger. For Daniel, it is a sobering reminder of the vulnerability he faces. For Mary, it is a painful realization that her actions have real consequences. For the neighborhood, it becomes a moment of reckoning, an unwelcome glimpse into how easily prejudice can manifest and harm those who are simply trying to go about their daily lives. Ultimately, the incident highlights issues of racial profiling and unwarranted suspicion based solely on appearance. In the final chapter of our expanded look at the encounter between Mary Thompson and Daniel Green in Maplewood Heights, we see how a single phone call to the Cedarbrook Police Department rippled through an entire neighborhood, exposing the deep undercurrents of bias and fear that can lurk beneath everyday life. Following the resolution of the confrontation, Daniel finally makes his way to his friend's home. Though relieved that the officer left without further incident, he cannot shake the feeling of vulnerability that remains. He recounts the episode to his friend, who listens with growing horror. Together, they reflect on how swiftly a normal day can be derailed. Daniel decides to share the story with a wider audience, not for revenge, but to spark dialogue about the real impacts of unfounded suspicion. He considers posting on social media or contacting local community groups, believing that meaningful discussions can prevent future misunderstandings. Mary, meanwhile, is left grappling with guilt, embarrassment, and stubborn traces of the fear she felt. She paces around her living room, replaying the event in her mind. Was she truly wrong to call the police? She wants to believe that anyone in her position, seeing an unfamiliar car, might have done the same. Yet, she cannot ignore that her assumptions about Daniel were not rooted in any concrete evidence. He was simply a man waiting in his car, doing nothing to indicate criminal intent. The part that troubles her most is the realization that her decision to dial the police stemmed from an internal bias about who she deemed out of place in Maplewood Heights. Neighbors also find themselves discussing the event in hushed tones over fences and on porches. Some defend Mary, arguing that caution is better than neglect. Others criticize her actions, pointing out the harmful repercussions of calling law enforcement on a person who was not committing any crime. The question arises: how can Maplewood Heights preserve its safety without becoming a place where residents are profiled simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time? In the ensuing weeks, the Maplewood Heights Community Association holds a special meeting. Residents gather in the local school gymnasium to air their concerns. Daniel's friend, along with Carol Jensen, the neighbor who spoke up during the incident, attends to share an account of what happened. They explain Daniel's perspective: a daily routine transformed into a tense encounter because someone allowed bias to guide their actions. The meeting reveals that many in the neighborhood are uneasy about how quickly the situation escalated. A few individuals suggest practical reforms. One proposal is for the community association to establish a clearer process for verifying concerns before involving the police. Another is to host periodic, get-to-know-your-neighbors events, reducing the likelihood that someone who actually lives or visits Maplewood Heights is treated as an interloper. Some residents even suggest diversity and implicit bias training for those interested, recognizing that fear often arises from ignorance or stereotypes. Mary, though hesitant, attends the meeting. She listens to stories from people who have been racially profiled in other neighborhoods or even in Maplewood Heights itself. She feels a pang of sadness and shame, realizing that her actions reflect a larger societal issue. Nervously, she stands before the group and offers a shaky apology to Daniel, who is not present but represented by his friend. She acknowledges that she acted on fear and expresses regret. Though her apology cannot undo the distress she caused, it serves as a small step toward accountability. Daniel, upon hearing about Mary's public apology, experiences a mix of relief and lingering hurt. He appreciates that she is willing to acknowledge her mistake, but he also knows that instances of profiling happen far too often to be chalked up as isolated events. Still, he holds on to the hope that honest conversations and self-reflection can lead to genuine change. In the end, the incident underscores the damaging power of racial profiling and unfounded suspicion. It acts as a case study for how quickly everyday life can devolve into a confrontation when bias is left unchecked. For Maplewood Heights, it is a wake-up call: the community's veneer of harmony can be shattered by one person's assumptions. For Mary Thompson, it is a lesson in self-awareness and the pressing need to examine ingrained prejudices. For Daniel Green, it is yet another reminder that even mundane actions can be policed in ways that threaten one's sense of security. The hope, of course, is that the fallout from this incident sparks lasting improvement. More neighborly openness, a willingness to address issues of race and belonging, and a commitment to examining biases before letting them dictate harmful actions. Although the event cannot be erased, the community has an opportunity to transform a negative situation into a stepping stone toward greater understanding and respect.